As the movie begins, we see an astronaut named John. He has just woken up from his hibernation pod, refreshed himself, and arrived at the control room of his spaceship. There, he meets his two fellow crew members. The three of them are currently occupied with the spaceship's maintenance work. Their mission is to travel to Saturn's moon to collect natural resources that could be brought back to Earth for use. This journey is expected to last nearly 9 years. During this long voyage, they spend most of their time in hibernation. Every 3 months, they wake up from their hibernation pods to check the spaceship's maintenance, send reports back to Earth, and then return to sleep for another 90 days. To sustain such long periods of sleep, they also have to use certain drugs. After completing their tasks, we see that John is confused. When Nash asks him what's wrong, John explains that he can't remember his girlfriend's full name, nor can he recall her voice. Hearing this, Nash reassures him that it's nothing to worry about, it's just a side effect of the drugs they take for hibernation, which can cause memory loss. But he assures John that his memory will return soon enough. After checking all the systems of the spaceship, John sends a report to Earth, stating that everything is fine. They are currently on their path to reach Saturn's moon via a slingshot maneuver. After sending their report, they prepare to go back to sleep. Before doing so, John starts to recall how he and his girlfriend first met. She, named Joy, was his colleague and the mission trainer. As he remembers this, Joy's full name comes back to him, and then he falls asleep in his hibernation pod once again. The next time they wake up from hibernation, John is the first to wake. He feels dizzy from the extended sleep and sits nearby to stabilize himself. Suddenly, the spaceship shakes violently, and when John looks up, he notices that screws from the ceiling are loosening. One of the ceiling panels falls and hits John on the head, knocking him unconscious. When his two companions wake up from their hibernation, they find John unconscious and notice the broken ceiling panel. They rush to the control room to check the CCTV footage, and it shows that the spaceship had experienced a massive jolt, damaging many of its internal parts. They turn on the ship's computer to assess the extent of the damage, but the computer shows no signs of any issues. This discovery makes Nash paranoid. He fears that the ship's computer is not reporting crucial information, which could endanger their lives in a critical moment. Nash believes the spaceship is no longer fit to continue the mission. He tells John that if they try to continue their journey to Saturn's moon, they will likely die. Nash had also discussed this concern with Captain Frank, but Frank refused to return to Earth. He insists the ship is safe. Nash suggests they wake up 12 hours earlier from their next hibernation cycle, reprogram the ship, and turn it back toward Earth. John agrees, but only on the condition that he first investigates the situation himself to confirm if Nash's concerns are valid. So as planned, they wake up 12 hours earlier during the next hibernation cycle. Nash is extremely anxious, fearing that the ship's systems have failed and that their deaths are imminent. But John calms him down and checks all the spaceship's systems himself. According to him, there's nothing wrong with the ship that would warrant abandoning the mission. While they are discussing this, Captain Frank suddenly appears. His early appearance surprises both John and Nash, as they expected him to wake up much later. Frank reveals that he overheard their conversation in the kitchen last time, and like them, he had also set his hibernation pod to wake him 12 hours earlier. Frank reassures them that there is no major problem with the ship. John agrees with him. Frank promises that if any issue does arise with the mission, he will personally redirect the ship back to Earth. While they continue their conversation, Nash's condition worsens as he grows increasingly panicked, convinced they need to return to Earth immediately. Frank forcibly controls Nash, calming him down. Meanwhile, we see John experiencing strange hallucinations. He begins to imagine that his girlfriend Joy is on the spaceship with him, although he knows it isn't real. John returns to the spot beneath the ceiling panel that caused his earlier injury. One of his companions had reattached the panel. He opens the panel to investigate further, wondering if there was indeed a fault. Upon opening it, he sees several wires sparking. Before he can react, a large explosion occurs due to the sparking, causing significant external damage to the spaceship. Gravity inside the spaceship fails. External pressure pulls John towards space. He tries to grab onto the spaceship's parts to hold himself inside, but he is unable to save himself and falls into space. At that moment, we realize that everything John experienced was just a hallucination. He returns to his hibernation pod. The next time they wake up, they discover it's time to change their slingshot maneuver. They need to adjust the orbit path of their journey. Nash is still against it, convinced that there is something wrong with the spaceship. But Captain Frank and John are determined not to abandon the mission. Together, they make the necessary calculations and successfully change their slingshot path. The ship experiences a massive jolt and several alarms go off, signaling the system is overloaded. However, Frank presses the button to continue the mission. Nash believes they are about to die, but in the next moment they realize they have safely changed their path. It's a major success, which they celebrate together. In the following days, they remain awake to monitor their new path. To distract himself, John engages in exercise on the spaceship. He tries to keep himself as busy as possible, but now his mental state isn't letting him do much. He starts having hallucinations, as if Zoe is around him. Captain Frank assures him that Zoe is not inside the spaceship. Meanwhile, we see Nash in an empty space, and his condition is worsening. When John asks him what's wrong, Nash confesses that he can no longer remember the names or faces of his parents. John tells him that it's due to the hibernation drugs, but Nash replies, "How can I be sure? Something bad is happening to me. I'm not okay. I can't even understand numbers anymore." As they talk, Captain Frank calls them to the control room because there's an error in their calculations, which could affect John's slingshot. John and Nash work together to fix the calculations, and Nash informs them that the low-level command reactor of their system is malfunctioning, causing all these problems. John realizes this too, and he's also feeling unwell. Captain Frank knew they might suggest going back to the last checkpoint, so he pulls out a gun and blackmails them into returning to their hibernation pods. John complies and heads to the pod, but before going under, he sees Frank torturing Nash. Frank strikes Nash on the head with a gun right before John enters the hibernation pod. What happened afterward, John doesn't know, as he fell asleep. The next time John wakes up from the hibernation pod, he doesn't see anyone around. Suddenly, Captain Frank approaches him, and John asks about Nash. Frank tells him that Nash became too unstable, so he had to forcefully lock him inside his hibernation pod. After hearing this, John tries to focus on his work maintaining the ship, but he notices his arm turning blue. It could be a side effect of the hibernation drugs. His arm then swells and takes the shape of an alien, frightening John. However, the next moment he realizes it's just another hallucination, and his arm is fine. John is now constantly seeing hallucinations of Zoe. He loves her deeply, which may be why he can't get her out of his mind. Frank then reveals a painful truth to him, that there was never any real relationship between him and Zoe. In fact, Zoe was their mission trainer, and the company had instructed her to meet John in public places to monitor his mental health and assess his suitability for the mission. This revelation drives John into a rage. He confronts Frank, saying, "Who are you to comment on my life? Stay out of my personal matters." John returns to the control room to repair the radio system. He wants to concentrate on his work, but memories of Zoe keep disturbing him. Suddenly, someone contacts him via radio, asking a lot of questions. Before John can answer, the call disconnects. Frank arrives and asks who John was talking to, but John remains silent. Frank then tells him, "It's time for your next hibernation cycle." John doesn't want to return to hibernation, but he knows that Captain Frank will go to any lengths to get his way. So John locks Frank inside the control room, saying, "I'll only go into the pod if you let me meet Nash." Frank responds, "You've lost it. I can't disturb his hibernation cycle. If anything goes wrong, we'll all be in danger. So listen to me go to sleep now, and I promise you'll meet him when you wake up. It's safer for both of us." Tricked by Frank's words, John unlocks the door, but Frank immediately points his gun at him and forces him to go to the hibernation pod. John recalls how Frank attacked Nash when he refused to comply, so this time John fights back. A fierce struggle ensues as John tries to grab Frank's weapon. In the scuffle, John breaks Frank's nose, knocking him unconscious. Desperate to save himself, John returns to the control room and tries to find Nash using the CCTV footage. Before he can find Nash, Frank reappears and attacks him. However, John fights back, beating Frank to death. He didn't want anything else to go wrong on the ship. John then goes to the control panel and asks the AI about the rest of the crew. To his shock, he learns that there was never any other crew member on board the ship. From the beginning, the only crew member aboard was John himself. When John asks the AI for his full name, he discovers that his name is John Frank Nash. The two characters, Nash and Frank, were nothing but parts of his hallucinations. Upon realizing this, John is devastated. He contacts Earth, confused and unsure of what's happening to him. To his surprise, Zoe responds from the other side. She explains that there was a problem with the system, which resulted in John being overdosed with hibernation drugs, causing his hallucinations. After learning this, John tells Zoe that he no longer wants to continue the mission and wants to return to Earth. Then, in another shocking twist, John learns that he wasn't in a spaceship at all. He hadn't been traveling through space. He had been kept inside a facility designed to mimic a spaceship to prepare him for space travel. This facility was located about 1,000 feet underground, built to study the effects of hibernation and hibernation drugs. John is utterly confused by all this information. He tells Zoe that he can still see Jupiter in space, and the slingshot maneuver ahead. Zoe explains that it's all part of his hallucination. She also reveals that the shockwave they felt earlier wasn't from the ship malfunctioning, but from an earthquake. That's why John couldn't find anything when he checked the cameras, and why his communication with headquarters had been cut off. Due to the earthquake, they couldn't inform him about the overdose. Now the experiment is over, and Zoe tells him that he can exit the facility. The door to the airlock will lead him outside. Following Zoe's instructions, John opens the door to leave, but just then, Frank reappears, warning him not to go outside. John, still thinking he's hallucinating, ignores Frank and steps outside. He finds himself in a desolate place, filled with broken mechanical systems. Over the radio, Zoe reassures him, saying, "Trust us. We'll get you out of here." As John moves forward, a monkey appears before him, and at that moment he realizes that everything he had seen and heard was indeed just a hallucination. He was still on a real space mission, and with that, the story comes to an end.